Strange Shadows, a Carcash and Smith podcast.
In the year 2197, the first intimation of a strange peril of worldwide scope and gravity came and passed unrecognised for what it really was in the form of a newspaper dispatch from the Sahara, reporting a sandstorm of unprecedented fury. Several oases, according to the report, had been entirely blotted out, and a number of caravans had been lost in the sweep of the tremendous storm, which had towered to a height of 12,000 feet and had covered many hundred square miles. No one caught in it had come out alive, nor had any trace of the missing caravans been found. Subsequent dispatches brought the news that the affected region was full of minor upheavals for weeks after the cessation of the main disturbance, and that a furrow of suspicious fear had been excited amongst the desert tribes, who believed that the end of the world was now imminent.
Greetings and welcome to Season 1, Episode 10 of Strange Shadows. The voice you just heard was UK horror writer KT Tate, reading the opening paragraph of the story that we're going to be covering today. I am one of your hosts, Tim Mendes.
And I'm the other one, Rob Poyton. And yes, today we're covering another of Clark Ashton Smith's, fairly long story, this one, The Metamorphosis of the World, which has an interplanetary element again, but could also be seen as perhaps a precursor to climate change fears, maybe.
Indeed, yeah. I thought that instantly, like the paragraph that just been read. It just, it just sounds like some of the news reports you get these days, doesn't it? About crops and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, and particularly the Sandstorm. We'll talk a little bit about that later on, because there have been some very recent, particularly extreme sandstorms as well going on. So quite prescient.
Yeah.
So when was this one written, and was this one published straight away, or was there a delay again? Need I ask?
Yes, well, to go into full Smith mode, this had a tumultuous gestation period.
Ooh,
there we go.
Very nice, very nice.
Now, it was originally written in late 1929, and then he revised it in early 1930. It then sat unused until 1951.
Wow.
I know, right? I mean, that's a long time for a story just to sit there gathering dust. It appeared in the September issue of Weird Tales that year, where it was published as Metamorphosis of the Earth.
Oh, right, yeah, I saw there was a name change to it.
Yeah, that change was at the behest of August Derleth, it was basically Derleth who got this published.
Oh, right.
Because by all accounts, at this point in his career, in his life, Smith was really struggling financially and all the rest of it. Smith writes in a letter. It's just after Thanksgiving, and he's writing to August Derleth. And the Don he mentions is Donald Wandry.
Oh, yeah.
And they met up for Thanksgiving dinner. And he goes, Don tells me that Weird Tales is now paying about a month before publication, which I suppose means a long wait before payment for the novelette, The Metamorphosis of the World. No cash has come in at all lately, which threatens to put me on the spot for living expenses. So, yeah, he's really struggling at this point. And, the whole publication thing is quite interesting, because it was in a letter dated the 10th of August, 1950. Smith has sent a load of unused manuscripts to August Derleth for basically to look at and publish in a collection.
Right.
But he knows that basically Derleth knows that Smith is skin. So he's got yours of the 7th just in. I read over the manuscripts you sent, and of them I think that The Metamorphosis of Earth is the best one and could possibly be placed. I'll have it retyped and try it with Weird Tales first, since I know they would like your name more often on the contents page. I will certainly want this story in a future collection for Arkham House, but I think you should try and get some money for it first.
Yeah.
Because basically there's $120 you could get for it, which back then is quite a lot of cash.
Yeah, well, that 1950, was it? That was less than he got paid for the Monster of the Prophecy, was it? Which I think was it 125? I think we said last time.
Yeah.
So I guess at the time, even that amount, I guess he was happy to get whatever he could by that stage.
Yeah, it's interesting because you can see by this point that Derleth's because in that letter I just read at the beginning, Smith goes on to ask if you can make me any advance on royalties, I'd be very grateful.
Wow.
But there's a little bit of frustration creeping in here from Derleth. Yeah, it's a response to his earlier, ask for money and things like that. He goes, yes, I suppose you will have to wait for some times before getting a check from Weird Tales. But might I make a suggestion? Why not write a series of stories which you could sell not only to Weird Tales, but to some other magazines in the field? And the field has never been more crowded. Then you would assure yourself something like a monthly income. Mac tells me your stories are always in demand, but that she seldom sees any on offer.
Well, and I guess by this time, Smith wasn't really writing that much at all, was he?
No.
He'd gone out of the writing fairly quickly and into his art and sculpture and painting.
Yeah.
And then I suppose with his circumstances, he was so busy working just to eke a living that everything else went by the wayside. I think he did write some stories a little bit later on around this time, but very few from what I remember.
Yeah, it's quite sad to read things like that, but how much he did struggle, because he struggled a lot financially.
Yeah.
Towards the end of his life, a lot of the letters are basically Smith asking for advances on royalties.
Yeah.
Just to keep himself fed and watered, basically. And it's strange because reading them, I just have like so much respect for August Derleth, because the guy did his best. The guy really did care about him and all that, and he went out of his way. Like I say, this story probably would never have been published in anything other than a collection.
Yeah. Yeah. If
it hadn't been for Derleth going, hang on a minute, this is good, I'll type it up neatly and send it off to Weird Tales for you, try and get you a bit of cash, So it just gives me so much respect for him.
Yeah, well, we know Derleth gets a bad rap. We've spoken about that before, and we often hear ourselves, and especially on the Innsworth Book Club, sort of laughingly refer to his mythos shopping lists and everything else.
Yeah, but
But that aside, the guy seems to have a genuine care and affection for these people who he knew. This is not a publisher who gets a manuscript in and just says yay or nay. He was friends with them,
Yeah, I mean, like I say, he gets such a bad rap, but I mean, it's like these collections that he's putting out. It wasn't a case of him trying to make money out of Smith. It was him trying to make money for Smith.
For Smith, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that a lot of people don't realise that, or just conveniently forget about it so they can stick the screws to him. But I think it's really unfair when you read this.
Well, without him, we wouldn't have most of this, would we?
Well, exactly. That's it, isn't it?
We'd be talking about cricket or something. No, we wouldn't.
No, we wouldn't be talking about cricket, mate. No. Something a little bit more interesting. Yeah.
All right, so let's get into the story. And as usual, shall we start with our words? What gems did you pluck from this story?
There wasn't that many in this one, but one of them was actually a medical term.
Oh, yes.
Locomotor ataxia.
Yes.
Which I had to look up, which is impaired coordination. It's the Latin, which I liked. Another one was promulgation.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, which means to promote. And the third final one I found was, there we go, concomitance.
Right, yeah.
Which is a phenomena that usually follows or accompanies another.
Oh, nice. I'll come back to the medical term in a minute because I've got an interesting fact on that one. I also had to look up calamites.
Oh, yeah.
Which I didn't know, which are carboniferous trees, which obviously ties into the story as we go through, and ties into that idea of Venus, which we'll talk about as well. There was one phrase that I really liked, which was carnal crimson, which I thought was a lovely alliteration. And nice,
I wrote that down as well, because I was going to bring it up when we went through. Yeah.
Now, the ataxia you mentioned, this sort of degeneration of loss of control of the central nervous system, can be caused by strokes or alcohol abuse, but back at that time was mostly a result of syphilis. And is the cause of death on Bram Stoker's death certificate.
Is it really?
Yes.
Blimey.
It was seemed to have been used in a sort of bit of a shorthand way of saying syphilis back in the day. which I believe was also the cause of death for Lovecraft's father.
Yes, it was, yeah.
And I'm not sure if his mother had symptoms as well.
Yeah, they both had the madness brought on by the disease as well. Because that's what
Right.
Lovecraft spent his entire life worrying himself sick that he was going to go mad and end up in an asylum like his mother.
Yeah.
So
Maybe that accounts for his sexual inactivity, shall we put it, to a large extent, or lack of interest in. Perhaps there was an underlying fear there. But, you know, it's we shouldn't really speculate about people's psychology who
no,
died 100 years ago kind of thing. But, well, we can speculate, but don't pay any attention to us.
Yeah, exactly. Neither of us have letters after our name. We don't know what we're talking about.
So, yeah, there weren't a lot of words in this one. And of course, there's some of the usual very vivid Smith language, but nothing as baroque as we saw last time or in Satan Braziros or those sort of stories. Because it's quite... well, this is a straight-out science fiction story, isn't it, really?
Well, it's, yeah, and even Smith didn't think highly of it himself. He actually referred to it as about the nearest he came to hack work.
Yeah. And it's set in the future. It's set in the year 2197, which I don't know if is an anagram of 1927. I did wonder if that was like a 1984 thing. You know?
Possible, yeah.
And as we heard from KT Tate there, it opens with this report of this huge sandstorm in the Sahara. Now, I did a little bit of research on sandstorms just to see how this one figured in the scheme of things. And I believe here it says that the clouds in this one reach up to 12,000 feet high. Now, a usual sandstorm, even a fairly large one, the clouds go up to about 50 feet. So this is spectacular. And even a large one, like a really major event, you might get sort of stuff thrown up to about 5,000 feet.
Yeah.
We know the Sahara sand gets blown all around the world, right? You once a year you hose it off your car, don't you know, that sort of red dust?
Yeah, it rained sand in Macclesfield when I was a kid.
Right.
Like it looked like blood.
Nice.
It looked like a rain of blood because it was just red sand like raining down on the streets of Macclesfield on the cobbles. It was quite atmospheric.
Do I need to put a little Slayer track in there?
Yeah, raining blood. Yeah.
So yeah, in meteorological terms, this is absolutely huge event, unprecedented. There was a very large sandstorm March last year actually, in the Gobi Desert.
All right.
And to give you some idea of the scale of that, it lasted for 20 hours. It killed over 1.5 million livestock, and a number of people unfortunately lost their lives as well.
Bloody hell.
And it blew about 600 miles all the way to Beijing. So that is considered a large one. Yeah, this one it seems to be 10 times the amount of that.
Yeah.
So is this a natural event is the question, and of course we soon find out no it isn't.
Yes, exactly.
And even though it's a science fiction story, we do get these other elements in. Smith tells us that the locals believed implicitly that Iblis, the Mohammedan Satan, had come to establish his kingdom on earth, and as a preparatory measure was creating for himself and his subject demons a suitable soil and atmosphere resembling those of the infernal realms.
Nice.
And in some ways they're not far off the truth, because this is something preparing the earth for their own habitation, isn't it?
Yeah, I love the description he gets here as well. When he gets reports from a caravan in Timbuktu, which made me chuckle. It's like I don't know why it made me chuckle. It's just whenever I see Timbuktu written down, my just childhood, you know. They said that the long rolling dunes of sand had all disappeared to be replaced by solid earth and mineral forms such as no one had ever seen before. The earth consisted of great patches of a sort of violet-coloured clay, very moist and with a noxious odour that had almost overpowered those who ventured to walk upon it. So, yeah, it's like it's been turned into an alien thing, you know.
Yeah. And this is where we get Smith's vividness come through again,
exactly.
with the colours, the red, black, blue and dark green.
Yeah.
Crystallised, metals are white and iridescent. And I like this, the members of the caravan swore they'd seen a huge boulder heave visibly from the earth and had watched the crystals swirl on the sides of these boulders. So this metamorphosis is happening in front of their eyes. It's a fast process. This isn't something that happens over years or decades.
No, definitely. It's it's basically terraforming, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So, of course, we get a team of American scientists put in charge,
of course,
headed by one Roger Lapham, who's the most renowned American geologist of the period. So he's really the central character in this story, but we don't really know anything about him. We don't really get anything of a description. It's just pretty much a name and a title.
Well, I don't think there's any dialogue in it, is there? If there is, it's very minimal.
Yeah, and it's kind of written in a way... almost like news reports, isn't it? I get that sort of feeling.
This is what I wanted to bring up, actually. It reminds me, because I've just read a whole hell of a lot of it, it reminds me of the works of Ambrose Bierce.
Right.
Because he did his stuff in a reporter style.
Ah.
Most of his stories were written like news reports, and because he was a journalist, so he wrote them in a very journalistic fashion.
Yeah.
And I wonder if this is kind of the way it's written is almost a nod to Bierce, because, they knew each other, didn't they? Smith and Bierce. So,
yeah. And also perhaps in some respects the Call of Cthulhu, though I'm not sure if that, I might just predate this or about the same time, I think, possibly.
Well, Ramsey Campbell actually speculates on that in the introduction.
Oh, right.
He says that it reads very Lovecraftian. Yeah. Even though, especially like some of his more portentous pieces, shall we say?
Yeah.
So.
And I think it's a shame because in doing that, it takes a lot of any feeling of drama or danger out of it. It is almost like sitting there reading a report of something that happened a few years ago, and you don't feel particularly involved in it, or you don't feel for the people involved in it, even though some quite nasty things happen.
Yeah. Well, that's it. We're going to get into that now, aren't we? Because basically Lapham and his party, they go off to Timbuktu in a couple of chartered airplanes, and by the time they've landed, there's a new and unexpected angle to the strange story. Yeah, it's not pleasant, is it? The people from the caravan who've witnessed it, they've all been struck down.
And I thought this was quite nice, and maybe it was an early example of this kind of trope. Where you land on the planet or whatever it is, and they're overcome by these ailments and illnesses, and again, very sort of Star Trek first generation kind of thing.
Yeah.
Several of the men had shown a violent homicidal mania, which they were already too weak and ill to carry to the point of action. Others had tried to commit suicide in a sudden and delirious excess of melancholia and nervous terror, and 6 of the 8 were afflicted with peculiar cutaneous disturbances which would have suggested leprosy if it had not been that the disease portions, which developed and increased with remarkable rapidity, were of a bright green colour instead of being white, and had purplish borders. I mean, this is like classic Star Trek in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I thought classic Doctor Who, something like the 70s stuff. I could see this as a serial in the John Pertwee era, because a lot of that was eco-horror. Because at the time that was when people first started with the hippies and everything, first started thinking, hang on a minute, we're kind of ruining the planet here. So a lot of the stories around that time, like Inferno, The Green Death, they were all about these, like drilling into the earth and releasing primordial ooze, and it
messing with nature, kind of.
Yeah, messing with nature. Yeah, the eco horror thing.
Yeah.
It also brings to mind like the works of Victor Pemberton. He did a radio serial, The Slide, which it reminded me of, and also Nigel Neal, who did a lot of.
Oh, of course.
He did a lot of eco horror stuff.
Yes.
The other one I got was a little known French film called. I'll say the English name. I'm not even going to try and say it in French. The Grapes of Death. It's a proto-zombie movie, but it's an eco thing, and it's all about the pesticides that they used on the grapes, turning people into like undead flesh eaters kind of thing. And it reminds me of Arthur Machen's The Terror. So in a way, this is like a forerunner of the eco horror trope, which only really became a trope in the late 60s and early 70s.
Yeah.
So again, it's way ahead of its time for me.
Yeah, and I suppose it's drawing on that earlier Maccan stuff where the landscape is imbued with this perhaps sort of supernatural weirdness or supernatural element. But now this has got a scientific base. In this case, extraterrestrial.
Yeah.
In other cases, like we said, the man meddling in things, or
Yeah.
I guess the nuclear age brought a lot of that stuff in as well, didn't it? Films like
Indeed.
Them and that.
Yes,
kind of
all your giant bug movies, them, giant Deadly Mantis and Attack of the Crab Monsters and all them classic Corman films.
Even sort of Godzilla as well, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah,
wasn't it? Godzilla formed from radiation or something?
Yes, yeah, all the kaiju stuff. Yeah.
So, yes, this is what has happened to the people who live in the area, and Lapham and his team go in, and I thought we've got a guy called Sylvester, and as soon as I started reading about Sylvester and how he was being set up, I'm sorry, this is another Star Trek reference, I thought, Red Jersey.
Yeah, Red shirt. Yeah.
Sylvester ain't coming home.
Yeah.
And now we get some more very vivid description, and this time we've got the minerals and rocks, but now we've got plants as well, which is very nice. And again, puts me in mind of some of Smith's later stories where he has the carnivorous plants in the gardens and
what is it?
Is it the Maze of Maldweb?
Maze of Maldweb, yeah.
And I think there's
another one about like the flower women of something or other.
Yes, yeah. And here we have a queer plant with etiolated fungus-like stalk and broad serrate leaves of a carnal crimson mottled with grey blotches. Around it, the pinkish lips of younger plants were protruding from the soil. I still can't help feeling that Smith is being a little bit...
being a bit filthy. Yeah.
I don't think you can...
It is... No, it's almost like Geiger's vaginas with teeth in it. It's
vagina dentata.
Yeah.
And of course, Sylvester, who somehow ended up well in front of all the others, strolls up to one of these plants, and the thing goes for him like a python.
Yeah.
Constricts him in coils. He screams in terror, and we get a nice little scene where they try and cut him free. I guess this is pretty much the only action in the whole story, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a Day of the Triffids kind of thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I love this line, though, here. As Lapham and his conferers came closer, they saw that the reeds were covered with lip-like formations that recalled the suckers of an octopus. Nice. So you got the tentacular in there, you know?
Yeah, there's a lot of nice little touches in this story. It's just a shame that it doesn't work as a drama, if I can put it that way. Well, at least to my mind.
I actually really enjoyed it. I think it would actually make a really good episode of 70s Who.
Yes.
Or, you know, I think it would work better on screen because you can show all this stuff rather than... Because this is a lot of telling rather than showing, isn't it?
Yes.
So I think that's, where it differs to a lot of Smith's work.
Yeah, yeah. So Sylvester doesn't die immediately. They take him back to the camp, and they see that the suckers from this plant have implanted themselves into his limbs, which are now swollen and discoloured. So they try and cut these out, but to no avail, because he never recovers consciousness. He goes into a delirium during the night and then falls into a coma, and at 10 the next morning he's announced dead. And they have to inter him straight away because, well, he's already kind of bloating and decaying. Which, of course, you've got to have a bit of putrescence in Smith, haven't you?
Oh, yeah. I love this understatement in the next paragraph. A sense of ominous gloom and oppression was thrown over the whole party by the chemist's fate. You think? I love that. It's the really funny thing that I love about reading science fiction from this period, even though it's set really far in the future. Like even to us now, it's set way in the future. You can still picture them in tweed.
They've got protective suits made of tweed.
Yeah, you do. You can just see them back in the lab puffing on a pipe, in
a sterile lab, and they've got the pipe going.
Yeah, they've got the pipe going. Yeah. It brings to mind Nigel Neal again, doesn't it? It's quite a mass.
Yes, absolutely. Well, this would fit Quatermass perfectly.
It would. Yeah, it's very.
I mean, this is almost like the first movie, isn't it?
The
guy coming back from the rocket, the sort of. He turned into a sort of plant monster Shoggoth.
Yeah. I've got Neil's novelisation, and it is similar, yeah, in a lot of respects.
Yeah, so you wonder if he drew on this at all, if there was any influence, perhaps. So it isn't just Sylvester who suffers, but all the party come back with some kind of effect. They all have symptoms of various types of illness.
Yeah,
almost like like a radiation sickness or that kind of thing.
Yeah, because it mentions a subatomic dust that has sort of been infiltrating them, and not just through respiratory, like through their pores, and it's been getting through their suits and gas masks, and because there's a lovely bit where they had to fly to Britain to get some gas masks and stuff.
Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah, and one of the planes crashes, right, because the pilot collapses. So
yeah,
Lapham was on that plane, but he does get saved along with Dr. Adams, who I don't think we ever hear much else about.
No, Adams was just the one who looked after Sylvester, wasn't he? And that's pretty much.
Yeah. And they had previously tried to radio their findings out back to London or back to America, and the signal's being blocked. So again, it's that very sort of familiar trope now of going into this other place and there's no communication with the outside world, and it's a hostile environment.
Yeah, there's another bit that shows its age here. It made me chuckle. Because obviously these radio reports that the bits that they did get back were picked up by the local papers, and local papers are like, they're going to spin it however local papers want to spin it. So yeah, they've one journal went so far as to insinuate that the Saharan manifestations were part of a plan for world domination that was put into practice by the United Oriental Federation, which then included China, Indochina, Burma, and Japan. Others were inclined to name Germany as the instigator. This is interwar, isn't it? So
this is very much of its time.
Yeah.
So Germany would still be the villain,
the big bad. Whereas now, it'd be Germany. It'd actually be out there trying to sort it, probably.
Yeah, but the interesting thing about China and Japan working together, whereas anyone who knows the history of those countries know how unlikely that might seem to be.
Yeah, exactly.
And I do feel, perhaps I'll just mention this now because it is something that struck me. Later on, they used the Venusian technology to sort of reverse engineer it into making all these weapons. And they discovered the Venusians have this means of transmitting pictures and information through the ether, through the basically television. And you think this is 2197. I mean, if you think this is, 100 years ago this was written? Round about 100 years ago?
Yeah.
How far communication has come in that 100 years?
I was thinking that when I was reading it, because it was on about the radio transmission and things like that.
Yeah.
And also about the fact that they couldn't see what was going on. I was just like, well, nowadays you just got Google Earth.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, whack a satellite over it. I mean, you've got all that stuff going on as well. Apparently those satellites can photograph a fag packet from up in space and all that sort of thing.
Well, there was that report recently, wasn't there? Some cop in America, he got caught having a bit of rumpy with somebody on the bonnet of his police car because the satellite went over.
Wow. Can you just picture about 12 people in that monitoring room all gathered around a screen going,
yeah.
Human nature never changes, does it? Whatever the technology. So yeah, and I always feel this is why we'll talk a little bit at the end about science fiction versus fantasy, because Lovecraft and Smith spoke about this, and I do feel with science fiction it can date very quickly.
Yes,
particularly from this era, and I think it does show, because like you say, well, why wouldn't they do this or why wouldn't they do that? And it's interesting to think he was thinking so far ahead in the future, yet he had no concept that we might have internet or television or satellites, for example.
Yeah. I always find I love reading science fiction from this sort of period because of that very reason. It's like, because some of their ideas are so far out there that you're just like, even now it's just like, no, that never happened. But some of them, it's like, they've got a personal radio, but it's like a tiny little radio they could fit in their pocket. Yeah. It's just, and we've got mobile phones that you get, like,
Oh, some things are very accurate, aren't they? Yeah. So, also when they get back, as well as having to go into hospital because most of them have fallen ill, they discover that there's been another event as well, this time in the US, in Missouri, where half the state is covered in unmelting snow. There's been a tremendous storm of dust in many towns and cities, including St. Louis, and they've been utterly swallowed up. All communications has been cut off, and there are great billowing clouds that soared to stupendous height, and from which emerged a sound like the rumbling of thunder or the explosion of unaccountable tons of dynamite. So we now have a second event, certainly of the same magnitude, but it seems slightly different in appearance or what goes on. One seemed like a sandstorm, this seems like a sort of snowstorm almost or something.
Yeah, it's almost like they're trying different techniques, isn't it?
This goes on for about a week or so. And of course, people from the surrounding area are fleeing. And again, at this time, once you start getting the gist of what's going on, it's hard not to think of War of the Worlds with this as well.
Yes.
How much of an influence War of the Worlds was. I would imagine Smith must have been aware of Wells, surely.
Oh, yeah.
Lovecraft was
Well, he does mention Jules Verne, doesn't he, at one point in it? So.
And the horrible thing we get with this American storm is the victims get all these usual symptoms that they had in the Sahara, but all their hair falls out, all of their hair, till not even the finest down remained. And then the places where the hair had been were covered rapidly with a grey formation resembling mould. And this was examined and was proven to consist of minute vegetable organisms, which increased with remarkable fecundity, always a good word.
Always a good one.
And soon began to eat the skin and flesh beneath. So this was a really horrible, painful death. Again, you have that element of sort of radiation sickness, all the hair falls out, but then it's replaced by this necrotic mould that eats you alive.
I mean, that brought to mind Hodgson.
Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of Hodgson is about mould and fungus.
Yeah, the fungus.
He had some kind, like Chambers and his grave worms.
Yeah.
Hodgson had his mould.
There was that one where they discover the ship, isn't there? And
Voice in the Night.
Yeah, that's
one of my favourites.
We should cover that sometime. That's a great
I've
story.
put that on my list because there's actually an old late 40s or early 50s TV adaptation that's up on my thing.
Oh, brilliant!
I managed to track it down.
We'll cover that on the Innsmouth Book Club at some point. Yeah.
Mm.
And this is where we get these astronomical discoveries as well, because Lapham had this theory that the source of these events were some sort of ray being beamed in onto the Earth.
Yeah.
So that leads to astronomers making a study, and especially looking at our neighbouring planets, and they discovered these flashes of white light coming from Venus.
Yeah, it's about that time they noticed the anomalous asteroid-like objects sort of hovering directly above where these disturbances have taken place.
So this is pure science fiction, and again, I do feel he's ahead of his time, because this is like all those old 50s films, isn't it? You know,
yeah.
The satellite hovers above and does the death ray to below, or whatever it is. It's
I can hear the sound effect in my head.
That's very good.
No, thanks.
So yeah, and Lapham decided, he seems to have a lot to say for himself, Lapham.
Yes.
I wonder if it's just like, if you've got a central character doing all this exposition, it's easier than introducing all these different scientists and everything else. Perhaps that's why he did it. But he determines that the satellites are mechanical spheres that have been discharged from Venus, and that they contain living beings and also apparatus for the creation and use of the destructive and recompositive rays that have brought about the singular manifestations in Africa and America. And he said all that without drawing breath.
Yeah, I was going to say, he's a verbose chap, isn't he? Again, I can just picture him in tweed puffing a pipe, sitting in a lab talking, pontificating to nobody, but there's nobody there, him just talking aloud to himself. And that's how it would be in a 50s B movie, wouldn't it? I postulate that these mechanical spheres. Yeah.
Yes, and I don't know how he gets to the fact that they've got living beings in them and who are working these sort of rays, because they could be entirely mechanical. I mean, most satellites would be of that kind of nature. But nonetheless, that's what he thinks. And, well, there's no agreement, actually, because we are told there's great division of opinion among scientists as well as among the public concerning the validity of Lapham's theory. But no one doubts that they are the source of these storms and the new terrain that's been formed. And we get this interesting observation that the two orbs are different in colour. The one over Africa has got a ruddy tint, and the American has a bluish tone.
Yeah.
So I think, like you said, does that mean one is the desert, the sand, and then this one is a different climate, so it's the snow and everything else?
Well, it's interesting because this is where we start getting the whole terraforming idea, isn't it? Just like, the Venusians are, trying to make it habitable. So they're trying to turn the climate of the Earth into the climate of Venus. Basically, it's got too hot for them up there.
And this is an interesting thing that we have at this time. There are a lot of stories around this time, the sort of early science fiction and into the pulp era, set on Venus or about Venus.
Yeah.
So people like Klein, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Stapleton, Heinlein, C.S. Lewis all wrote Venusian stories of one form or another. And Venus was most often depicted as a sort of lush jungle planet. Usually populated by dinosaurs.
Yes, yeah.
It's almost like a younger version of Earth. I don't know if it's because it's closer to the sun, so it's a bit warmer or something like that. So it is like a sort of prehistoric Earth, which then ties in, we had that word calamites later from the Carboniferous era, which was, what was it, 100 million years ago or something like that. I'd have to check that, but certainly way back. And you can picture that very vividly. Everyone had dinosaur books as kids, right? You remember those pictures of the huge ferns and trees with a brontosaurus or something poking through, and there's a T-Rex in the background. Whether they all lived at the same time is another question. But so that was the sort of view of Venus, and it becomes apparent that what they're doing is trying to turn the Earth into Venus because the temperature goes up. We get all these strange plants and minerals. That's the Venusians' plan.
4 days after the publication of his latest prophecy, because he's seen some more of these flashes, he's like, right, we're in for it now. A bunch more of these spheres appear. So you've got one. The first storm is over Mesopotamia and Baghdad and Mosul. And then you've got the Black Forest in Germany and the Pampas of the Argentine. And the one over Germany is of a sulfur yellow hue. And the one over, this is the bit where I thought about the internet. The satellite above Mesopotamia was too far east to be in range of European astronomers. It was, Google Earth now, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's a sort of implication there, is that apart from Europe and America, no one has astronomers, isn't there? Even in 2197. That's a little bit of its time, isn't it?
But I suppose if there was this block that he mentioned, this power block, maybe it was almost like Cold War sensibilities.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Whereas, Russia had their own scientists and astronomers, but we didn't ask them what was going on in the 60s, did we?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah, again, that's almost like the 1984 thing, isn't it? Was it Oceania and the two big sort of superpowers again, I guess, isn't it? And this is where we get the Venusians have landed, right? The first Venusian colony has landed, and this is in the original storm site in Timbuktu. We get tell of a strange meteor that had fallen in broad daylight upon the region of mass vapours in El Juf. And this was not like a normal meteorite. This falls with a preternatural and deliberate slowness in a vertical line. So this is a controlled descent. It's not something crashed into Earth.
That'd be a...
See, the sound effects I got now is the UFO series from, was it sort of late 60s?
Yes, the UFO. Oh, yeah. BBC Radiophonic Workshop, yeah.
And the desert people are still looking upon this as a portent for telling the advent of Iblis and his demons. So they're still sticking with their religious angle.
Which I think is quite realistic, really, because that is precisely what would happen.
Absolutely, yeah.
If, you'd have the scientists saying one thing and then the church saying another.
This is the rapture, or this is the return of whatever, whatever religion it is. In most religions, there seems to be this idea of the return of something, doesn't there? Or
Yeah, there's always an apocalypse, there's always a flood, and there's always a return of
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
It seems they're the three like recurring points through pretty much most religions, I think.
And the bad news is there's even more flashes coming from Venus, which tells us there's even more of these satellites on the way.
There's about 30 of them. There are.
Yes, yeah, within 5 days, no less than 30 additional storms of atomic dust were reported from all over the world. So this is an invasion. This is not a one-off. Let's establish a little base here. This is an all-out invasion, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we get the list: Berlin, Vienna, Florence, Tehran, Jerusalem, Kabul, Samarkand, Chicago, Kansas City, even Pittsburgh.
I like that. And Pittsburgh.
Yeah, and Pittsburgh. I always like Pittsburgh because that's where they filmed the best zombie film ever.
Indeed. Yeah, well, it's George Romero's stomping ground, wasn't it?
Yes, yes.
Now we got another mention here when he's talking about how the Argentine tract lengthened towards Buenos Aires, and he's talking about the ravages in northern Africa extended as far as Lake Chad, which that takes us back to to Zombie, because that's where that was set.
Oh yes, yeah. It was the same area, wasn't it? Yeah, yeah. And this again, we get these huge measurements. That's contributed to a cloud of fine steam 20,000 feet in height, which again is quite beyond anything that. I'm not sure, maybe volcanoes. When was the big volcanic eruption in Europe a little while ago?
The Icelandic one.
The Iceland one that grounded all the flights. Yeah, I don't know how high that got to. Perhaps one of our listeners can let us know.
And I remember the weird thing when the cloud came over. I'd gone shopping and I'd gone in a supermarket and I came out and it was like yellow. Ooh. It was really weird. It was just like, what is going on?
Did you fall to your knees and pray to Cthulhu or Sathogua? Sorry, I do beg your pardon.
I think I did the typical British thing of going, well, bugger me.
I better buy some toilet rolls.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Before the rush.
Yeah, better get some cans of Spam and some beans. Yeah.
Yeah, that's English prepping, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Cans of baked beans. There you go.
And of course, as a result of all this, we get absolute madness and pandemonium. And there's the word, concomitance. Madness and pandemonium were the concomitants of the 30 new storms. Unending throngs of people poured in all directions towards the littorals of 5 continents. The entire shipping of the world, both naval and aerial, was laden with men, women and children who sought to flee the planetary peril. So, not unnaturally, and quite as you'd expect, this sparks a huge refugee crisis as well.
Yeah.
Whole populations on the move.
Yeah. I do find this interesting, considering like Lovecraft, Mountains of Madness, that their answer is to go up to the Arctic.
Yes. Because he does notice, doesn't he, that these are not really, they're not touching coastal areas so much. So.
Exactly. Yeah. Or cold climates. But if you think about it, it makes sense. Venusian, they're going to be almost tropical. And actually, just jumping ahead slightly, when we do get a description, they are kind of lizard-like.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, they're reptilian. Well, let's go to that, because the next part is really how they're setting up these labs in the Antarctic and everything else. And, of course, while they're there, they're getting the daily news of how the destruction is ongoing. From radio operators who were brave enough to remain at their posts till an unresponding silence offered proof that they had been annihilated one by one. That's quite poignant, isn't it? That reminds me of that. Yes, we're holding on, and the enemy is coming, but it's that.
Well, again, George Romero, Dawn of the Dead.
Oh, of course, yes.
Because you got that punctuating all the way through that. You got that TV show. We're going to stay on the air as long as possible.
Yes. So this is where we get the first sighting of these silver spheres close at hand. And this is in Kentucky, Tennessee, where all good UFO sightings start.
I love this guy because it is just the most Kentucky or Tennessee thing you've ever heard. It's a guy who just like, I'm not moving. You kiss my ass. This is my orange grove.
Darn aliens.
He's got an orange grove or something, hasn't he? He's like, I'm not moving. It's took me years to grow these fucking things.
And this orange grower, he's got his 12-year-old son with him, sees this orb emerge, and it's flying at less than 30 miles an hour, and it comes gently to Earth within 300 yards of the orange grower and his son, close to the edge of their orchard. And this is so typical, again, of that 50s film and everything else, isn't it?
Yeah.
A framework comes out as it approaches the ground, consisting of 4 tripods. In this position, the lower part of the globe was no more than 15 or 20 feet from the ground. A circular trap opens in the bottom, and a stairway of metal steps was let down to Earth. I mean, this is the day the Earth stood still, and
Plan 9 from outer space.
yeah, all those things, isn't it? Yeah. And this is where we get our first glimpse of the Venusians, who are quite small, actually. They're only 4 feet tall, which I guess you'd want sort of quite small people if you're travelling vast distances in a cramped...
in a sphere, yeah.
Yeah. And we're back to this thing last time. These aliens are really quite alien, aren't they? They're not... it's not a man in a silver suit with,
Yeah. You're not your typical little green man, is it? Mm.
No, but it's your 50s aliens always had those great hairdos, didn't they? Like a big white bouffant hairdo.
Yeah, they did, didn't they? Yeah, they were always platinum blonde, weren't they? They always looked like rejects of Pan's people or something, didn't they?
So they've got 3 short legs, 4 extremely supple and jointless arms. The arms are all long enough to reach the earth and were used to a certain extent in locomotion. They're equipped with natural coverings like the shards of insects, or else they wore some kind of armour or suiting made of red and green metals, for they glittered gorgeously in the sunlight. So these ones are almost sort of insectoid.
Yes.
And we don't know at this stage, well, we presume they're Venusians, but are they just the ones who pilot the machines? Are they the real Venusians? Are they the servitor race or what,
Yeah. It's basically when they come out, they start investigating, don't they? And obviously the Orange Grove has interested them, so they go off and take some samples and all the rest of it. And it seems like these guys are doing your typical scientist thing of landing somewhere. Let's get some soil. Let's get some vegetation. These juicy orange things. These look interesting. So you take them back to the spheres, and interestingly, what happened to our guys when we went into their territory happens to them pretty much.
Yes, which again takes us back to War of the Worlds, doesn't it?
Indeed.
With the microbes. Yeah, and this sphere is later seen floating in the sea, apparently lifeless or inactive, and it's surmised that the occupants had fallen ill and perhaps dead, or at least no longer able to operate the mechanism. So we have the potential to capture one of these things and get a good look at it. So what's the first thing they do?
Shoot at it.
Shoot at it with a 7-inch gun.
It's the most American response ever, isn't it?
Now, a 7-inch gun is like a huge naval gun.
Yeah.
This is a big gun.
Yeah.
And they're going to fire... the crew of the planes decided to fire a 7-inch shell at the exposed portion. I don't know why they're doing this, really. I'm not quite sure what the thinking is here.
Well, every government on the earth. Come on, let's think about it. What would our lot do? Go on, chaps, get the Navy to fire a couple of shells,
But you think if you make a hole in it, it's going to sink, surely.
Yeah.
But, they fire the shell and they manage to hit this thing somehow, and it just bounces off anyway, so,
It just gives it a bit of a dent.
Yeah. So, all right, what we'll do then, we'll tow it to shore instead. We'll tow it to land.
And then they start trying to blow it up.
Then we'll try and blow it up. Yeah. And I like that when they get close to it, they find it's got little sort of circular and oval windows in it, filled with semi-translucent materials of green, amber, and violet. It's always the colour with Smith, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Yeah. Again, it just harkens back to those 60s psychedelic sci-fi films,
So, yeah, they try and crack it open with explosives, working up to thorite, a terrible new compound of solidified gases with which whole mountains have been shattered. So they're really getting the heavy stuff in on this, and still not really getting anywhere. It has done some damage.
Well, they've managed to open the hatch with it, haven't they?
Yeah.
They've managed to blow the hatch open
and managed to destroy most of the mechanisms around.
Yeah, they've knackered everything inside, yeah.
But they do manage then to get inside. And this is where, now this goes back to our last story as well. The interior was divided into a great number of curious compartments with octagonal walls, and had probably accommodated more than 1,000 of the interplanetary voyagers on its trip to Earth. So again, that's that sense like the beehive, isn't it?
It is, yes, it is. Almost that sort of insectoid thing again.
Mm.
Something I love here is it's back to your like your red shirt analogy. It's because you got these guys who were chosen for their braveness to go inside and take a look. After everybody else has been in these places, everybody who's been anywhere near anything to do with these Venusians, right, has come out in boils and sores and mold and God knows what else. It's just seriously, come on. If you come with me, do you want to go in there? Fuck off. You know.
It doesn't even say that they've got suits on, does it? It just says several scientists entered by means of the ladder. Yeah.
In you go, lads. You know.
But this is like the Star Trek thing again, isn't it? When they beam up and bring something up for the planet, we've got no idea what this is, but we thought we'd beam it just back onto the ship.
Yeah.
Not into any sort of sterile condition.
Not into quarantine, just into the transporter room. Yeah. Yeah, Mr. McCoy, have that.
Super spreader event.
Yeah.
So they start looking around the ship, and we get the description of the great curving tubes and cubes, rods and wires, a 100-angle lens of glass-like materials, and obviously, again, all very alien tech.
Mm.
Though it's kind of interesting that this, to me, still sounds quite sort of Victorian or Edwardian.
Yeah.
Everything's on the outside, isn't it, in those old things? Whereas when you look at something today, everything's on the inside. It's like a little chip inside your nice, smooth, whatever.
Yeah.
But back then, all the wires are on the outside and everything else.
Yeah, and there's a lot of glass tubes and vacuum tubes and tubes for this and tubes for that and tubes for the other. Mm. Again, that's why I'm picturing these guys in their tweed with the, you know, the H.G. Wells thing, you know, there's lots of brass.
So it reminds me very much of those old films of 20,000 Leagues to the Bottom of the Sea and Captain Nemo.
Yeah.
When they go on board the submarine, and it's that same apparatus, even though it's a submarine, it's like a big lever and a steam engine or something.
Yeah. We're back to Elton John's Time Machine again, aren't we? It's all that kind of that aesthetic. Yeah.
And this is where they find the dead Venusians, who apparently have been engaged in dissecting the body of someone they captured in Guyana, some poor guy they picked up.
Flayed him.
Yeah, laid open.
Sod.
And I thought this was interesting because they no longer have this gorgeous green and red shards on that the orange guy had reported them as wearing.
The orange guy.
What,
Donald Trump.
The orange man. No, the orange man is something else again.
Yeah.
I say to you, Venusians. So this was their protective gear, I presume, then, because they've taken that off.
Yeah.
And now we see that they are more reptilian than insectoid. Nothing other than their sort of scaly skin is denotive of the reptile or indeed of any terrene mammalian form.
Mm.
Long curving arms, round bodies, necklace globular heads offered a vague hint of enormous tarantulas. That's quite creepy, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So they're spidery sort of things, a bit reptilian. Again, very alien.
Yeah.
Which is quite imaginative, I think, from that writing perspective.
Yeah.
And I thought it's interesting because here we start to see the roots, perhaps, of this, because we have three types of alien now. I think you have the reptilians, the Nordics, and the Greys.
Yes.
And these fit into that early reptilian category, I guess.
Yeah.
With a hint of tarantula.
It's interesting as well because, I mean, it's like Lovecraft's description of the great race of Yith. Again, that's very, very alien. It's not the sort of thing, you know, his giant rugose cones with sort of weird tentacle things coming off them and a head on a stalk and all this kind of stuff. And even the Mi-Go.
Yeah, you know. I wonder where they got their inspiration from those things, because I mean, I've not particularly read. I'm thinking of the John Carter of Mars. Everything had sort of arms and legs and was vaguely mammalian or humanish.
Yeah, they were mostly sort of bipedal, humanoid.
So it'd be interesting to speculate where they got their inspiration from these things, or did they just think let's just think up the maddest thing I can think of? You know?
I do think Lovecraft did that, you know. Right, how can I top the weird thing I came up with last week? Right, we'll stick a tentacle there. We'll stick a fleshy lump with fungal growths that flashes red, yellow, and green when it talks here.
I think he had early access to deep sea creatures because some of those things just fit perfectly in the Lovecraft. And some of those things that,
Yeah, like the nudie branches and things, all that kind of weird.
yeah, I mean, they've only been discovered in the last 20 years or something. So they're still being discovered today, right? Some of those things.
Yeah, well, I thought that not long ago they discovered the Squid Worm, which is one of the most Lovecraftian things you've ever seen. It's a long, like snake-like body with loads of like flippers, like fins that are like blue down its length,
Wow.
and then it's got pink tentacles.
Oh, nice.
Bright pink tentacles. It's like I've got one in the Berlin Zoo. It's like I'm trying to convince my missus to let's go on holiday so I can have a look at it.
There's a selfie worth taking.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's pretty much the end of the story.
Yes.
Because this one has a little bit of an odd ending as well, really. You might expect there to be... Oh, it is determined that these Venusians died because of contact with certain streptococci, which obviously harmless to humans pretty much. But so again, it is that War of the Worlds common cold kind of idea.
Yeah, well, Staphylococcus is food poisoning.
Oh, right.
Yeah, Staphylococcus aureus, which I always thought sounded like a dinosaur.
Yeah, do you think one of them had the salmon? Was it the salmon?
Yeah.
The salmon mousse.
On cocktail, yeah. Salmon mousse. The salmon mousse.
And we get, sort of what happens at the end here. It gets sort of dragged out weeks and months, lengthened somehow into a year. And of course, this metamorphosis continues. But because they've captured this sphere, they, as we said earlier, they can reverse engineer some of the technology.
Mm-hmm.
And machinery for the direct utilisation and conservation of solar energy on a large scale had been perfected. So, because of this technology, they discover how to make solar panels.
Oh, yeah. Nice.
Which means in the Arctic and Antarctic, they can get rid of the ice and snow to some extent and start to get some sort of agriculture going on. So, humanity is basically confined to the North and South Poles, but can start living there now.
This is where they start their counter-attack, isn't it? So
Yes.
again, reverse engineering.
Yeah, because they make this ray that makes it possible to penetrate the vaporous air that enshrouded the new terrains and to watch the habits, movements and daily life of the invaders. So there they can see that the Venusians are building cities in these places.
Yeah. Again, we've got that sort of almost hive-like thing, a peculiar squat type of architecture in which some of the buildings were septangular and octagonal, while others were cylindrical.
Septangular's good, isn't it?
It's a good one.
I want to use that in the story. Septangular.
I was expecting a non-Euclidean to creep in there, but it didn't. So,
yeah, but he used this in Monster of the Prophecy, didn't he?
Yes.
With this very sort of geometrical designs and the marquetry and the towers and everything was sort of rhomboid or octagonal kind of feeling. Very sort of regular, but not regular. Everything we have is square or round, isn't it? You know, it's not the norm in our own buildings.
Yeah.
And of course, this being Smith, we get reports of their sexual habits as well. They're bisexual and their young were hatched from eggs.
Mm-hmm.
And we even find out they had a sort of pictorial art of a geometric type resembling cubism and a written literature that seems to be concerned mainly with scientific and mathematical problems. And we get this thing we'll talk about in a little bit, that these Venusians have evolved a purely materialistic civilization.
Yeah.
They're all about the science. They've got no religion. They seem to have no faith or superstition or spirituality about them. They're purely scientific.
Yeah, I love this about some of the instruments. Like the sundry instruments, tools and engines that they employed were a source of perpetual marvel to human inventors. There were optical instruments with a series of revolving lenses arranged above each other in metal frames, by means of which they apparently studied the heavens. It spouted the cloudly pall that hung forever upon their dominions. It was thought, however, that perhaps their myriad-faceted eyes were more or less televisual and could penetrate many materials impervious to human sight. So that's going to that, again, that reptilian thing, isn't it? Like, sort of, and like just animals in general. Like, it's believed that like cats can see things that we can't. And
yeah. Well, it's that idea, and I suppose that's the Lovecraftian sort of expression as well, isn't it? We live on the island, small island of ignorance. because our sensual range across all of our senses is really extremely limited.
Yes.
And the conditions we need to survive in is a very narrow band.
Yeah.
If the Earth was another X thousand miles out from the sun, this would be, an Arctic waste. If we were in a little bit closer, then it's, as they discovered in the 1950s, Venus is basically a toxic planet. You couldn't possibly live on it.
Yeah.
Nothing, or certainly as we understand it, Jim, life couldn't exist because the conditions are so toxic. So it always interests me to see how people present alien life forms that can exist in these environments, and how different would they have to be from us in order to survive in those environments.
But again, it's like some of the creatures that we have just lurking below the sea. Another recent discovery was the Yeti Crab, which live in volcanic vents.
Wow.
So they can live in these ridiculously hostile environments, but they're these little furry crab things. And they're great little creatures. But yeah, they've just evolved to live in these, like, anything else would just be like boiled to death.
Well, that's interesting, because you got the huge pressure there and the temperature as well, and obviously the lack of oxygen and everything else. It's it is quite amazing. I know we say it quite a lot, especially on the Innsmouth Book Club, that don't look outwards for Lovecraftian stuff. Look inwards.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Look at a microscope.
Yeah.
Look at a bed bug.
Things that live on your eyebrows and things like that. It's terrifying if you think about it.
I wouldn't mind. They're not paying any rent or anything,
No, yeah. Little buggers.
Can I monetize my eyebrows? So they spent some time studying the Venusians. They managed to make some things from this technology, including with the solar rays. They discover a way to turn that into a weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And this is sort of where the war starts, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
They actually start attacking. They send 400 planes to Australia who are fitted with this new weapon. And they manage to annihilate several of the metal spheres, as well as 2 cities of the enemy. So, having retreated and established bases, humankind is now striking back.
Yeah, it's the counter-attack, isn't it? It's the classic.
But this is all kind of dealt with very much at the end of the story, and pretty much in the last paragraph or two.
Yes.
Where you think this could be the big action scene, and again in a movie, this would be the big finale, wouldn't it? With someone waving stars and stripes and flying in on something and blowing the enemy king up or something.
Yeah. It's like even the main character, which I found quite strange, because he kind of disappears for a little bit, old Lapham, and then he appears just in the final paragraph, and it basically just says, Roger Lapham, whose clear logical brain and prophetic insight have always been a source of inspiration to his fellows, has died lately and is mourned by all. Game over,
And that's the end. And we're 20 years ahead now, right?
Yeah.
Because this war has been going on for 20 years. Yeah, Lapham dies, but his spirit still prevails, and we're going to fight on. And that's the end. It's rather a strange ending after all that build-up.
Yeah.
I wonder if he thought it's kind of written enough, because it's fairly long as it is.
Yeah, it's a novelette, isn't it? So.
Yeah. Or could he have been... You could almost picture this... I mean, now this would be a series, right?
Yeah.
So volume 1 would be the setup, volume 2, volume 3, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Or this is like a 5-part series or something, isn't it?
Yeah. What I found interesting is because one of the big tropes in any sort of alien invasion thing is like the second, obviously your first part is it arriving. Smith seems to skip the second part where we try to communicate with them.
Yeah.
There's no attempt to communicate.
That's a good point.
Which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, in fact, their first interaction with them is to try and blow this thing up, really. And
yeah, it's like, because, what would really happen is we'd send a bunch of bureaucrats on a Learjet and they'd come out in their suits and go, I'm sure we could get you this territory and you can have this territory. And,
You do dread to think, don't you, that, well, without getting too political, any current leadership anywhere, shall we put it like that, having to cope with extraterrestrial life when they can't even cope with terrestrial life.
Terrifying thought, isn't it?
Some of us are just praying for the mothership to arrive.
Oh, God. Come on, Cthulhu, rise from the sea. We've had enough now.
So, yeah, it is interesting from that perspective. And I think to an extent that's what takes a lot of the drama out of it.
Yeah.
There's no sense of... it's a series of events without much involvement. I feel very little emotional involvement with it. And that's it.
Yeah, I enjoy it. I think it's a good story. But, again, that may be because I've just been reading a lot of Bierce, so I'm used to that sort of journalistic approach.
Yeah.
And I think for that approach, it works very well.
Yeah.
And I think the strange thing is it feels, compared to what we've been reading of Smith, it feels dated.
Yes.
Even though it's been written after a lot of his other, like Tale of Satampra Zeros, it feels so dated compared to that. This feels like late Victorian to me. It just feels like he's almost doing Bierce or Verne or one of these other guys, because that was all because of it was the style of the time, wasn't it? It was all very dry and factual, and you had endless descriptive passages about how to boil a kettle, and
and then depending on the author, you'd have someone with a bit of British pluck go in and knock out the alien, whatever, or something, or blow up the thing,
someone in a pith helmet full of gin,
with his stout aide with him, and the aide's fiance kind of thing,
and maybe a faithful dog. Faithful dog. Spot.
Maybe he was trying consciously to do that. Perhaps he was trying to pitch new markets like Astounding or whatever, and this is...
Well, that was that's what him and Derleth do mention in another letter, is that he had originally written it to try and get out of the Weird Tales market.
Right.
Because he was basically... Because this was at the point where he'd already got cheesed off the Farnsworth Wright, rejecting all of his stories.
Well, you can't blame him in that respect.
No.
But isn't it's interesting that Smith is now known for Satampra Zeros and that type of story, and this type of story is not really... For the casual Smith or Weird Tales reader, probably won't have heard of this or read it.
No, it's a bit of an anomaly, really, this one, because it's pretty much a disaster movie with alien invasion thrown in.
Yeah.
And, it is a bit of an anomaly. It's like there's another anomaly, which we're probably going to be doing on the next one, actually. The Murder in the Fourth Dimension, which he did for a crime magazine.
Oh, right.
Again, because they were all written around this time where I guess he was just trying to branch out into other markets because Weird Tales was proving so problematic to get published in, because Wright was basically going, nah, it's too weird for a Weird Tales magazine.
Incredible. And was Weird Tales the only one really doing Weird Tales at that time?
There was Astounding Stories.
Yeah, that was kind of... But was everything else going more sci-fi, or obviously your detective or your crime? Or
they were.
What was the other one? Spicy Stories, Oriental Tales.
Spicy Oriental Tales and Spicy Adventure.
Very specific sort of genres.
Yeah.
And we don't get a lot in the letters between Smith and Lovecraft about this story. I think, as you said, Smith was not overly keen on it himself. We get a couple of little lines. So this is to Lovecraft, January the 9th, 1930. I haven't completed any more stories, though I am dragging on at present with the Metamorphosis of the world, and am now engaged in killing off an odious bunch of scientists. So he didn't really have much sympathy for his own characters there.
Of that, Sylvester.
Yeah, I don't know if you have much sympathy for scientists in general, which is something we might come on to. Lovecraft replied, this is January the 17th, 1930, I await the metamorphosis of the world with keen expectations, and likewise I wish I could see those new and monstrous pictures of trans-Arcturan nightmares. It's surely too bad that financial considerations discourage you from pictorial work, for that medium enables you to give the visible world a type of dream phantom almost impossible to convey in any other fashion. So this is referring to Smith is doing drawings and paintings now as well, which is something we'll cover in perhaps in a bonus episode or something. We'll talk about some of that.
Yeah, because he sent a lot of drawings and pictures of his sculpture and stuff to Derleth, so they talk a lot about that. So, yeah.
And then pretty much the only other mention we get is I finished. This is Smith to Lovecraft, January the 27th, 1930. One thing I noticed with these letters, by the way, is they responded to each other very quickly.
Yeah.
Normally there's a week, maybe 10 days difference between the two things. It's quite interesting. I finished the Metamorphosis of the World and am trying it out on the scientifction magazines. Sci-fi obviously wasn't a term then, so it's scientifction. That's quite
Nice.
Yeah, so I finished Metamorphosis of the World and I'm trying it out on the scientifction magazines. I don't know that you would care for it. Probably the best element is the satire. So, again, it's not really pushing that one.
Yeah.
And Lovecraft doesn't seem to mention it again, so I guess he was right. Lovecraft didn't.
Yeah, it's obviously one of them. Yeah, no, and after that first flurry of submissions, he just basically sticks it in a drawer and forgets about it until 1951.
Quite amazing, isn't it, that amount of time?
Yeah, it's like 20 years sort of sitting there, just gathering dust.
And was it even at that point he was kind of desperate to put stuff out, so he thought, "Oh, sod it, I'll you know."
A lot of those things that he released around that time, it was all in that he sent 7 manuscripts to Derleth, and they were all stories that had been written throughout his career, a lot of them fairly early, that he'd just done nothing with.
And wouldn't you think even at that time, in the 1950s, this would have still felt a bit dated, perhaps?
Oh yeah, definitely. And the thing is, some of them appeared in fanzines.
Yeah.
But yeah, for whatever reason, Metamorphosis of the World never did.
Yeah. So we also mentioned earlier this sort of science versus fantasy. And fantasy here, they both spell with a PH.
Nice.
Which I like as well. And how things are changing. So there's just a couple of paragraphs here. This is a letter from Lovecraft, 25th September 1930. Yes, it often amuses me to note how the sedate and established magazines used to take horror tales and fantasies without hesitation. Those were free and unstandardized days, and the prevailing view of the cosmos was one of awe and wonder, amidst which a bit of weird fiction was not at all incongruous. But all is changed now. The progress of science has pushed the idea of a clear-cut universe of cause and effect to the fore, and has cut down the area of mystery by unravelling many of the tangles of the human mind. Older interpretations and values are seen to be superficial and empirical, and a radical shift in natural emotional stresses has occurred. So it's interesting that Lovecraft, the scientist and the materialist, is kind of bemoaning the fact that everything's getting a bit too scientific.
It's strange, isn't it? Yeah.
And Smith replied to this. This is early October 1930. The future of fantasy is certainly a most problematic one. You analyse very clearly the reasons back in the present attitude, and I suppose you are right about the purifying process. When the novelty of modern discoveries has worn off, it seems to me that people must go back to a realisation of the environing, undissipated mystery which will make for a restoration of the imaginative. Science, philosophy, psychology, humanism, after all, are only candle flares in the face of the eternal night with its infinite reserves of strangeness, terror, sublimity. So he's got a nice attitude that, yeah, even all this is hard science at the moment, but that'll all soon fade away and we'll be back into the reserves of strangeness and terror, which is a...
He wasn't wrong, was he? It was like the resurgence of occultism in the 60s and all that. He wasn't wrong.
Absolutely, yeah. But it does seem to go in cycles, doesn't it? Because you had the Age of Enlightenment, but then you get this huge occult revival.
Yeah.
Well, again, the two were never really that separate. Like Newton was an alchemist and a scientist, and but then you get into the modern era and the Edwardian age. We've got the spiritualism and Crowley and all that sort of thing going on, and say in the 60s, and now we've got, I guess, conspiracy theories.
Yeah, that is the new like the new occultism, isn't it? It's, whereas in the 60s you had like all the doomsday cults and things like that, and even up to like the 80s with David Koresh in Waco.
Yeah,
you had these apocalyptic doomsday cults. Now you've got like QAnon, haven't you? Yeah. Which is this? It's almost a doomsday cult. It's just all online. And it's just out there for everybody to see. It's not some weirdos in a compound in Waco. It's, and it's infiltrating everywhere. It's quite insidious. you know.
Well, it is because the internet has infiltrated our lives in so many ways that I don't think have even begun to be fully understood yet.
No.
You can't help but wondering if there's some vast social experiment going on some level.
Yeah, it was like you know, your MK Ultra stuff like that. And there was always that one of my favorite sort of conspiracy theories about that was that video game cabinet. Was it? I can't remember. It was called Phasor or something with an A, PHA Saw or something. But it was a video game cabinet that they allegedly put into certain places, and it bombarded people's visual cortex with the same images that you were using during the MK Ultra trials, and it was sending people loopy. And then this cabinet disappeared and would turn up in a different arcade. And basically, it's probably a load of cobblers, but I like it. I like it as a story. It's a good story. And it reminds me of that, really.
And you know who's to blame, didn't you?
Well, the Illuminati.
That's an Nyarlathotep, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, it's got to be. It's got to be. Yeah, that's what I've always thought.
Got his fingerprints all over it.
Yeah, of course it has. Yeah, yeah.
May I be just the first to welcome our new glorious...
Our glorious leader, Nyarlathotep. Yeah, yeah. That pyramid with the eye in, it all fits.
Now, we get mention of Venus in this as well, and everyone knows about Venus, so there's not a lot to say there, really.
Yeah.
And it's known as the morning and the evening star, or Lucifer. The Egyptians actually believed it was two separate entities or beings. Tiamutri was the morning star, and Uaiti was the evening star. And the name Venus, of course, comes from the Romans, from the goddess Venus. The Roman name was Luciferus, and it was sacred to Venus, so Venus was the name given by the scientific community. I always think it's interesting, the scientific community gave all these bodies mythological names, you know.
Yeah.
Jupiter and Neptune and everything. I suppose it's more interesting than calling it Alpha 6 or something.
Yeah. And now I've got Pink Floyd's Astronomy Domini in my head.
Oh, now there's a great song.
Isn't it?
There's a great song. You can't beat if it's Sid Barrett.
Oh, you can't. I love that tune. Yeah.
Neptune, Titan, stars can frighten.
That's it.
Cool, right, so that's Metamorphosis of the World. Probably not, well, it's not a top tier Smith, but always interesting to read nonetheless, and I think it's thrown up some very interesting points there.
Yeah.
We're on to two shorter stories next time, I believe.
Indeed we are, yeah. One of which I want to use in an idea I've had for an Intimate Book Club special, The Deaths of Hp Lovecraft.
Oh, excellent. Great idea. Yes, we must do that. Yeah, that's the epiphany of deaths, right?
Indeed.
Which Smith told Lovecraft was inspired by Randolph Carter.
Yes, and it is dedicated to Lovecraft, and he basically kills him off in it, doesn't he?
Nice.
You know, which would seem to be a pastime of these guys, wouldn't it? It's like, I'm going to put you in my story and kill you horribly. And the second one we're going to cover, I touched on very briefly earlier. It's A Murder in the Fourth Dimension.
Brilliant. I've not read that one yet, so I'm looking forward.
No, I haven't. Yeah, which, from what I gather from the introduction, it's sort of Smith doing Christie kind of, but weird.
Nice. Looking forward to that. So we hope you can join us for that, listeners. And of course, as always, if you do have any questions or comments or suggestions about anything we've discussed today, do get in touch. You can post up on our Facebook site or on Patreon or on Buzzsprout, or you can drop us an email, of course, at innsmouthbookclub@outlook.com. While you're on our Patreon site, do look at signing up and joining as a patron to support the show. You get bonus content not only for this show, and I think we've got some readings coming up, haven't we, Tim, in the near future?
Yeah, I personally did some readings of Ambrose Bierce's work. I did one of his short anthologies, a collection of 7 very short ghost stories, so I'll hope to get that up soon.
Nice, and we're looking at doing a Halloween special. We might be doing a live chat from Innsmouth, so we'll put up details of that fairly soon. And of course, as well as getting access to bonus content for Strange Shadows and the Innsmouth Book Club, you also get a monthly copy of Innsmouth News, and at the higher tiers you also get a t-shirt and a chance to come on the show as a guest as well. I'd just like to thank all our existing patrons, including Chris Carr, Sharon Safia, Lee Clark-Zumper, Justin Woodman, Russell Journey, Wingate Stites, Lane Mullin, Steve Meyer, Aaron Vleck, Brett Kramer and Benjamin Slade. Thanks very much for your support, it is much appreciated. That's it for this time. We hope to see you for episode 11. And with that, it's goodbye from me, Rob Hoyton.
And it's goodbye from me, Tim Mendes.